These species are often some of the most iconic species on the planet. That's why, they're great clients, I like to say. People know them. They're amazing creatures. Again, like all the whales, the sea turtles, big cats all around the world, bats and giraffes. And, so when people think of the animals they know, 9 times out of 10, they will be a migratory species.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. And today we're going to be talking about an environmental topic. We're going to be talking about the UN Convention on Migratory Species. And our special guest today is Amy Fraenkel, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. And we're going to discover a little bit more about the first ever State of the World's Migratory Species, a flagship report of the Convention that provides a comprehensive overview and analysis of the conservation status of migratory species worldwide. So Ms. Fraenkel has over 30 years of experience in international environmental law and policy, and she's held senior positions in several UN agencies and also the legislative and executive branches of the US government, as well as having worked in the private sector as an attorney. Ms. Fraenkel, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. Would you like to tell us a little bit more maybe about your background prior to joining UNEP and how you became interested in the oceans and endangered species and environmental law?
No, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And essentially, I've always loved nature, just as a personal matter, love being in nature, love birds, love the ocean. And when I was thinking about my career, I was definitely thinking about doing something on the environment and ended up coming at it from the law side, although I've done a lot of science work as well. And eventually, found my way into the international realm. And as I'll talk about a bit in the program, really, whether you're working at the very local level, at the national level, you're still connected to the international world, both in terms of the ecological systems, but also with people around the world who have similar interests or challenges. And working at that level has been very rewarding.
Thank you for that. I wondered if you could also tell us a bit more about the convention. It wasn't one that I had really heard much about. Would you just like to explain a bit more about it?
Absolutely. So the Convention on Migratory Species, we call it for short, CMS, it was one of the treaties on the environment that was actually born out of a 1972 UN meeting on the environment that was held in Stockholm, a very famous milestone in the world of international environmental law and diplomacy and multilateralism. And the idea was very simple, which is, for what topics on the environment do we need to have a treaty? Do we need to cooperate across national boundaries? And in the case of migratory species of animals, these are animals that many people know: birds, whales, dolphins, but also elephants and lions, and animals that regularly cross national borders. And what it means is that the conservation work that a country does at home is not sufficient to ensure that these animals are going to be, that their status will be good, that they're not going extinct, that any use of them is well regulated. So it's at its essence, for migratory species, you must have international cooperation, and that's the very simple but compelling idea that's at the heart of the Convention on Migratory Species.
What do we need to know about this topic? You were just talking about the different species that migrate, and sometimes we see these wonderful maps that are put out about the migration routes and so on that are really spectacularly beautiful as well to see. And there are so many animals that are traversing thousands of kilometers sometimes. What do we really need to know about this?
Well, the first thing to know is that they need all of our collective help because, as we'll discuss, the trends are not looking so good for many species. And these species are often some of the most iconic species on the planet. That's why, they're great clients, I like to say. People know them. They're amazing creatures, again, like all the whales, the sea turtles, big cats all around the world, bats and giraffes. And, so when people think of the animals they know, 9 times out of 10, they will be a migratory species. And that means that these animals cannot stay in the same place year round. So migratory species have developed a very particular habitat need so that they move at a predictable time, often seasonally. They'll move from one area of the world or one area of a country to another because of the change of temperature and season. And so we all are very familiar with the migration of birds, for example, that change with the seasons, and they are in one place for where they need to eat and feed and get their energy, and then there's other places where they might breed and have their young. So what that means, as opposed to animals that stay in the same place year round, is that these animals also often play a very special role in the ecosystems where they're found. They transfer nutrients, they bring benefits. They can be like the anchor species in an ecosystem. If they are like a big cat, has a very important role in the healthy functioning of an ecosystem. They can control pests, and sometimes they're used for food, of course, and nutrition. So these animals are really a special set of animals in the world, wild animals, and yet because of their nature, they also face threats, perhaps more threats than species, again, that do not migrate. One reason for that, for example, is that if they're going across, transversing many different countries, it means that the laws and practices of these different countries will have some bearing on whether they're going to be conserved or potentially taken out of the wild. So again, that brings us back to the convention, which is really aiming to bring together countries, scientists, partners, conservation groups, all over the world to look at what are the ranges of these different species, what are their conservation needs, what are the key threats that they're facing, and what can we do about it together.
So there are lots of different stakeholders involved in this convention. Let's turn to the report, because it really is a flagship one. It's a major publication that you have released last year. It was so sobering to read that 1 in 5 of the migratory species are close to extinction. Tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, so this is, in fact, our very first report on the state of the world's migratory species. Again, it is our flagship report. One had never been done before, and yet, we have so many species listed under CMS as well as globally beyond CMS. There's about 1,200 species, migratory species listed under CMS, and the report also looked at 3,000 other species that are not yet on CMS that are also migratory. And we thought it was important to see, first off, how are they doing? What is their conservation status? What are the trends? If we look over time, have things improved, stayed the same, or declined? And also looking at the numbers, the population numbers for the different species. So their status, meaning are they threatened? Are they endangered? Are they critically endangered? And how are their numbers? And what we found was both sobering, I would say. Some of the numbers are definitely not the numbers we wanted to learn. On the other hand, I think we have to understand them very carefully and find also the positive points from what we learned. So first, indeed, about 44% of the species listed under the treaty are in decline, meaning that they're not heading in the right direction. One of the biggest groups that was of concern was the fish species, and the report found that 97% of the fish that are listed under CMS are globally threatened with extinction. So this was a big wake-up call. On the other hand, I want to highlight, some positive numbers, which are that 12% of CMS-listed migratory species are improving, and another 31% are stable. So, in fact, about half, I would say, if we want to think of it just in rough numbers, are either stable, improving, while half are in decline. Now, of course, we wanted to know what are the main threats, what's going on here. And what we found, the report laid out 5 different threats in order of magnitude. The top 2 are habitat loss linked with fragmentation and degradation of habitats, that's number 1. And the second is over-exploitation of species, meaning that too many of them are being taken out of the wild.
Yeah, it is quite sobering, but as you say, so there are some good news in that. Tell us a bit more then about the main threats and how we can best address those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the case of habitat destruction and fragmentation, this is really at the heart of conservation policy now. And to flip that around in a positive light, what we've identified as an absolute vital need for migratory species is what we call ecological connectivity. And what that means is that, as I've said, they rely on a network of different important habitats throughout their life cycles. So we need to know where are those and how can we conserve them in a way that it's viable for these species to use them, even if it's just a stopover. So, for example, some species might go from one location, fly thousands of miles to another just to refuel, because they know that that's timed in a way that there'll be a big food source there. And then they keep flying thousands of miles further to their final destination. So it doesn't mean we have to have complete protection of areas everywhere that these birds rely on. But knowing where they go, what they need, is really key information. So the first is knowing that. And then the second, of course, is taking the right actions to preserve it in a way that supports these species. Now, what we found is that migratory species are not the only natural phenomenon that needs ecological connectivity. The sort of old way of thinking about nature and protection of nature was to create what we call protected areas or reserves. Lots of people know them, they enjoy them, and those do play an absolutely vital role, especially when they're protecting a very unique ecosystem that otherwise would be lost forever. But doing it like islands of biodiversity is actually not the most effective way of conserving nature and supporting the natural systems that we need. So, for example, if you have a river system and you have animals and you cut it off or you dam it, and suddenly there's just a little area where it's protected, but outside of that area, it is not, or there's no corridors for the animals or to move or the trees to grow, then you've really limited the effectiveness of that conservation measure. So we're trying to bring to governments, to conservation experts, and into the UN discussions, this concept of ecological connectivity and what can be done at a very pragmatic level so that we can have connected ecosystems alongside of human activity for our infrastructure and so on, so that we are doing better planning. We're putting the development infrastructure in places that will minimize impacts on the nature that we also need for our well-being. So that's the first really important step. Now, on the second threat, which is on over-exploitation, that takes 2 different kind of levels, let's say. The first is just directed hunting, taking of species for a variety of reasons, and those can be, within sustainable limits. So if you're hunting and there's plenty of that species, there's no prohibition on taking it, that's the ideal scenario. But if you have species listed under CMS Appendix 1, they're so endangered that you're not able to take them. There's a prohibition to allow them to recover and hopefully move off of that list. So one issue is, is there legal or illegal activity going on around those species? The second set of species we have is listed on what we call Appendix 2, which means you're allowed to take them, but it has to be done in a way that's sustainable. And again, this requires good regulation, good population estimates, good permitting laws, good enforcement, et cetera. And we're looking at whether there's also issues around overuse, let's say, depending on the species and the place and what's motivating this. So this is all about sort of intentional directed take. But there's another threat related to overexploitation, which is bycatch. Now, bycatch is most familiarly known, in connection with fisheries. And essentially the concept is if you're fishing for, a target species, a particular type of commercial fish, it is frequently the case that other species get caught up in the nets or the lines. And so there's a lot of effort to reduce that, to look at technology, to look at enforcement techniques and so forth to avoid it. So among those species that are bycaught include many very endangered species, including whales and turtles, dolphins, as well as seabirds are often caught up in fishing lines, for example. So we're trying to work with the fisheries organizations and the fisher communities to see what can be done to ensure that those incidences of bycatch are reduced. As I mentioned earlier, we have a huge problem with especially sharks and rays in the world. The numbers are they're really under a lot of pressure. And so one of the conclusions of the report is we need to look at the species that are in most need of attention and action. And certainly in the case of many fish species, sharks and rays, those are one that need our help.
And I'm looking at a beautiful image of sharks and rays behind you on the screen. That's really wonderful to see. This idea of ecological connectivity as well sounds like quite a shift and new way of thinking about things. And it also sounds like there's, in the report it also emphasizes the importance of data sharing and a lot of collaboration around this. How does the convention facilitate it? And you've mentioned the different stakeholders and working with different groups and fishers and so on. What partnerships do you have with NGOs and academia and even local communities, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of ecological connectivity, it is not a new idea, but sometimes ideas just have their moment, and this is the moment for ecological connectivity. We've been working hard within CMS to advance knowledge on it and the importance of it, and looking at science, looking at policy. We brought, as a sort of community, the parties to CMS and the Secretariat, which I lead, and our key partners, kept raising this topic in other negotiations in the UN. So in the UN negotiations on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, just negotiated about a year or so ago, and it sets the framework for countries through 2030 on biodiversity, which of course migratory species are a part. And we were very happy to see that this concept of ecological connectivity was included in many, many targets and in one of the main goals. So if there's a protected area, it needs to be well connected. It has that language in it. So because of that, and the UN General Assembly, by the way, also adopted a resolution several years ago called Nature Knows No Borders. And this was led by governments from Central Asia, which said we need to do more work across borders. We need transboundary efforts for nature conservation. So you see this idea, it makes all the sense in the world, and it's kind of having its big moment in the sun, which to me is sensible, because it's a great idea. It's the way that nature was designed, and anything we can do to advance it will be helpful. Now, turning to our community, I feel very lucky that with this treaty, we have just an amazing collaborative spirit. I really believe it's unique, and I think it's because of the nature of CMS. The idea of CMS is that we have to work together because working alone won't solve our issues. And that is not only about governments. We have NGOs, conservation groups, scientists, many of the leading organizations around the world, academics who spend hours, they're dedicating their time because they really see the importance of this. And CMS provides a platform, provides a facilitating network in addition to, our core work. We bring these people together, and we're just really blessed to have this sort of wealth of expertise and passion, really, about these issues.
Yes, I can imagine it's really a passionate area to work in. So can you tell us a few sort of good examples where this type of cooperation has led to some really good outcomes for migratory species?
Sure. One really great example is in Central Asia, in fact, where we've been working for over a decade on the land animals that are found there. And many people are not so familiar with Central Asia and the great migrations that happen there. People think more of the Serengeti and in Africa and other parts of Africa for great migrations of animals. But there's an incredible migration across the steppes and the landscapes of Central Asia. And what we did through CMS is we brought all of the range states together. And we created what's called the Central Asian Mammal Initiative. And it's very structured. It has the support of us as providing a secretariat to support the work and to organize the meetings. Regularly, the countries will all come together and agree on a work plan that they see what are the priorities. We bring the scientists, the local people, and the conservation groups together. There's reporting on progress made, what are new threats, et cetera. So it's a really well-functioning way of working together across borders. And one of the great successes has been with an animal called the saiga antelope, where it had been under great pressure and the numbers just plummeted very severely some years ago. And that became a key priority for the region. And now we're happy to see an incredible turnaround in the numbers of that species, gone from, well under 1 million. I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers. It was very low, and is now over 3 million individuals. So the work is not completed yet because not every population is doing as well as others, but that's just a great example of where this kind of concerted work across international boundaries will really pay off. There's one other that I want to highlight because it's such an important topic right now, which is quite a different shift, which is on renewable energy. So we know in the work to address climate change and to bring new, cleaner fuel sources or energy sources to market, one of the key solutions is renewable energy, including wind power. But wind power and other infrastructure, if they're not well planned and not well sited where they're actually placed and built, it can actually have very damaging impacts on nature, including migratory species. And you think about, birds migrating and bats as well. And in the oceans, there's also impacts from sound, the noise of construction. So we took a very pragmatic approach to this, again, convened an effort called the Energy Task Force of CMS Energy Task Force, with countries, with experts, scientific experts, technical experts, and industry at the table, as well as investment banks, so some of the big multilateral investment banks and development banks, and looked at how can we map those areas that are really important for wind potential, and let's also map the migratory routes of the animals. And then let's use that information and put the investment and the infrastructure in places that will not interfere with those migrations. There's other techniques as well in terms of being able to stop the blades, for example, at different times, and other techniques about how they're shaped and so on. But the point is, we need real pragmatic solutions for sustainable development for both human needs and for the natural world. And this is something we're very proud of, and it's certainly growing in interest as the uptake for renewable energy is increasing.
Those are super examples, really super examples. So what are the main obstacles left to effective collaboration?
Yeah, I would say there's several main obstacles. One is that the drivers of environmental change, the things that are changing our environment, our natural world, and causing negative impacts in some cases to migratory species, are pretty much the same no matter what topic you're looking at. So if you're talking about climate change, you talk about biodiversity conservation, you talk about desertification, pollution, land loss. These are coming from human activities and the lack of integrating the environmental values and impacts into the activities. So as I said, in the example with renewable energy, you could do very bad planning. You could do, a very conventional way of doing business and have much worse impacts on nature. So we really do need to look at the root drivers of change, because otherwise our efforts are kind of, like pushing the rock uphill. And we really need to get the private sector, the signals, the market signals, the pricing, the consumption, the choices that people make to be ones that are supportive of a sustainable future. And we're otherwise we're going to be fighting maybe winning the battle but losing the war, so to say. So that's probably the biggest challenge that any of us working in the environmental sphere are facing, is these root drivers of environmental change. I think linked to that is just the competing priorities and the nature of economic politics and short-term gain. Like if there is a need for energy and there's a development need, there might be an impetus to do it very quickly and not to take that time to do it with more thought and planning. And so really trying to get these better practices into the hands of decision makers, make sure they're used. If we have these agreements in the UN, that's great, but are they actually being honored and implemented when it comes down to investing, million or billion dollar projects for one thing or another? So, it takes a lot of attention, a lot of persistence, a lot of communication, a lot of convincing people that doing this the right way, the better way, is a benefit in the long run for humans and for nature. And so it's a never-ending effort, but we're very pleased to be a part of it.
Wonderful. Exactly. You mentioned some of the, other UN processes in there and agreements and things. So thinking a bit, for example, this year's UN Ocean Conference that was held in Nice and so on had a sweeping political declaration and more than 800 new voluntary commitments across governments and scientists and civil society. And the declaration emphasizes the ocean's critical role in global climate mitigation. I was wondering, it provides strong global commitments, but how do these frameworks, including also the High Seas Treaty, support the work that you do and the CMS does for conservation of migratory species, marine ones anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was pleased to attend that meeting in Nice of the UN Oceans Conference. And, the oceans are part of our world that tend to be overlooked, or at least had been for decades or centuries. And we know less about the ocean still than we know about space. And there's so much we're still learning. And so, we also are working on issues like the potential impacts of deep sea mining, for example, and our parties adopted a resolution about that, saying that we need to know the science before we proceed with this, because we could be destroying very important ecosystem values and species and habitats. there's an importance for political statements and for ambition and leadership. And I think that's what we saw at the Nice meeting. There was a lot of very important commitments, even if they're not strictly saying enforceable, but nonetheless, we had some top leaders there making very public commitments that, we're going to do this, we're going to invest in this, and coalitions of people also meeting to say, this is a priority. In fact, we had a launch with the French government. They were leading this on sharks, in fact, sharks and rays. And so there was a great event basically pledging greater attention and bringing solutions to the decline of sharks and rays around the world. So for us, many, many issues at that meeting were relevant, and we're following up both through those more, let's say, soft partnerships as well as through our treaty mechanisms that we have. We have formal meetings. In fact, we have our next Conference of the Parties will be held next March, at the end of March in Brazil. And they will there be taking up new resolutions and decisions, looking at how we're doing. We will have an interim report, an update to that State of the World's Migratory Species, and other scientific documents that will help guide our work. And so this will be the place for us that is most important to keep setting our priorities and our way forward.
Excellent. And of course, there's also been the advisory position by the International Court of Justice on climate change as well, making it so that countries have a binding legal duty to prevent climate-related harm. How does that change the landscape for the CMS, and in terms of accountability, reparations, and so on, maybe?
No, it's very interesting to see that development, and I'm an environmental lawyer by training, so I followed that decision with interest. I would say that being a lawyer, I've learned in my career that using any tool that you have is important, and so using the tools of the courts is very important, both at the domestic level and now at the international level. But it's not only the legal tools that I think we need to use. As I said, we need to change policy, change hearts and minds, change, politics and decision making. And that comes through both legal results, but also through other kinds of work and communications, in fact. So I like to say that, no matter how right you are, you have to be able to communicate clearly in order to make your case and to advance change.
Yes, I absolutely agree on that. I also wanted to, perhaps about that, how can people best support the goals of the CMS? And can individuals or organizations get involved and contribute to it in some way?
Yes, the thing that is also very special about CMS is that everyone can relate to the things that we work on, because everyone probably is exposed to a migratory animal of some kind. So if you're outside and you look at the sky and you see a bird flying by, chances are you're seeing a migratory bird at some point in your day or your week. And if you're lucky to live along the coast, again, you'll see animals. If you live in places where there's wild land animals, you see them. And they're integrated into many cultures and communities and traditions and religions. So these are actually animals that people know, and it touches them. They have stories about them. So it's not some abstract idea of the word biodiversity is very kind of, clinical. And so to me, working with species is a really powerful way to make change in the world around nature conservation, because people can relate to it. And people can actually play a direct role. And there's a very famous story of an Amur falcon, a beautiful bird that was lived in a part of India where at one point in time, the villagers were trapping the birds, netting them for various reasons. And conservation groups and the educators and the government met with the villagers and said, there's a village and farmers, much like you, thousands of miles away in southern Africa. And those people are waiting for those birds to come to eat the termites that otherwise would destroy their crops. And so, they need to get there. You need to help them get there and not kill them in your forest. So they sort of a light bulb went off and they realized, we're part of a natural system. We're connected through these animals. And these villagers became stewards for the falcon, and they are actively now doing conservation efforts around that species. There are so many people around the world who are doing some action to help with migratory species. There's turtle rescue groups, stranding networks. There's people at all levels working, with communications, with conservation, educators. So, we are really a global community of people working on this, and it is a real, I'm so grateful to be able to do this work through the lens of the UN, which is very special, to bring it through governments, but it is absolutely an example of the act locally, think globally, act globally too. I mean, there's work at every level of government and in the local communities that's relevant to the future of migratory species.
What an inspiring and heartwarming way to end this conversation. Amy Fraenkel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure.